Tony, before the show starts, I think you need to tell folks we're on social media.
I do. We're on social media.
Well, there you go. We're now on Facebook and Instagram, and it's at Going Hollywood Pod on both of those.
So that's our handle, at Going Hollywood Pod, on both Facebook and Instagram.
And what are we posting, Tony?
And we're going to just be posting, we'll talk about the show occasionally, but mostly it's just going to be like, what's happening? Who's a birthday? Who do we want to talk about and commemorate today? Who died? Because that happens a lot. It'll be fun.
So it's at Going Hollywood Pod, and it's Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the show notes or on the website, goinghollywoodpodcast.com. You'll find them there too.
Go on, stay tuned.
Murder is an art, and as such, the privilege of committing it should be reserved for those few who are really superior individuals. And the victims, inferior beings whose lives are unimportant anyway. Obviously. You aren't planning to do away with a few inferiors by any chance? Who knows? I'm a creature of whim. Is it all over? Brandon! A stupid display like that in front of somebody else will be just as good as a confession. Being weak is a mistake.
Because it's being human?
Because it's being ordinary. There's something upsetting both of you a great deal.
I think we're going to get caught.
You've got to pull yourself together. It's odd the way one can pyramid simple facts into wild fantasies, isn't it? Good and evil, right and wrong were invented for the ordinary average man, the inferior man, because he needs them. This party will be the most exciting ever given. Oh, no.
Hello, I'm film historian Tony Maeda.
And I'm Brad Shreve, who's just a guy who likes movies.
We discuss movies and television from Hollywood's golden age. We go behind the scenes and share our opinions, too.
Being the average guy, my opinions are the ones that matter.
As does your self-delusion. Welcome to Going Hollywood.
Tony, I'm glad we finally got around to rope. I've been wanting to do this for a while.
Have you really?
And I'm looking for... Yes, I have been. And I'm really looking forward to having Stephen Dolginoff on as our guest. But before, I think we should make things interesting.
Oh, okay.
I don't really know Stephen that well, but he's just a playwright, so I'm certain we are of superior intellect. So I think we should have him come on early.
Yeah.
And make him comfortable.
Yeah.
And then when he least expects it, we'll take a rope. And then, oh shit, I just had an orgasm.
I don't know if I believe you or John Dahl with that. I'm not sure who gives a more convincing performance. Well, I am. I'm very excited to welcome my friend Stephen onto the show. I mean, what can we say about Stephen? But I can say this about Stephen. He is an award-winning playwright and composer of, among other musicals, Thrill Me, which the story of Leopold and Loeb, and here's the thing about when I first met Stephen and he was telling me about this, I had no idea. Okay. Thrill Me has had over 200 productions in 25 countries and translated into 17 languages. Can you believe that? I mean, this thing is massive. And I was always so impressed with that. And not only did he write it, okay, he played the role of Nathan Leopold off Broadway, and in a story straight out of 42nd Street and Not All About Eve, 42nd Street, and he recorded the role on the original cast album. So, it's amazing to me that this play of Stephen's has been in print for close to 2 decades. Not only that, I think, and he calls this his proudest achievement, and as he should, because I think it is too, he's the author of the recent book Thrillmaker, which is an Amazon bestseller, which recounts his 30-year history of that musical. So Stephen has a lot to say about Leopold and Loeb. Stephen has a lot to say about Thrill Me, and Stephen has a lot to say about Rope. So I think without further ado, Brad, we should bring him on to Going Hollywood. Welcome, Stephen.
Welcome.
Hi, guys. Hi, Tony. Hi, Brad. Thank you so much for having me. What a great introduction. Thank you.
I'll say your bio is way beyond not too shabby.
Well, thank you very much.
Did I read it?
Back at you guys.
Did I read it well? Did I read it like you wanted me to read it?
You read it perfectly. I think you are You're superior for sure. You are very
Well,
superior, Tony.
I heard that.
You know how to do this. You should have a
I
podcast.
heard that last night.
We talked about that.
But no, I think that what we should mention too, that we've been talking about Leopold and Loeb, we've been talking about Thrill Me, and we're talking about Rope today, which is from 1948, which is a Hitchcock film from 1948, but it is suggested, based, highly indicative of an actual real life people, Leopold and Loeb, who did a thrill killing. This is the 100th anniversary of the crime of Leopold and Loeb.
That's right, 100 years ago this year.
We didn't plan this. This just happened to happen now.
Kismet.
So I think it's amazing. So before we go into Leopold and Loeb, we're here to talk about the film Rope from 1948, Alfred Hitchcock.
And knowing the background, I'm really interested to hear what Stephen has to say about this film.
I am too. It's got starring Farley Granger, John Dahl, and James Stewart. Bria, what was your first memory of Rope? Stephen, when do you remember first seeing Rope, and how did it affect you?
When I was in high school, it was around the time VHS tapes were invented. Sure. And I used to go to this is before Blockbuster even, I used to go to the VHS rental place, and I would get all kinds of mysteries and sometimes horror movies. And Hitchcock was one of my favorites, so I got all of them. And Rope was a pretty early movie of his that I remember renting. And so I saw it when I was in high school, and it was always intriguing to me that it was all on one set. And as I know you guys know, Hitchcock filmed it to look like it was all almost one continuous take, but he did little tricks like zooming in on the back of someone and then zooming back out. And that was where the camera actually cut. Mm-hmm. And then there's a couple times when it actually cuts to somebody, but it was all in almost one room. It was all in real time. And it starts with a murder. So, there's no whodunit. You know who done it.
Right off the bat.
You know exactly what's going to happen. The question is, how are they going to get caught? And always fascinated me. It was always, up there for me. It's not one of my favorite Hitchcocks. I'm much more into Psycho and Rear Window. Right. But I liked it from the beginning. And then when I ended up working on a piece about Leopold and Loeb, who are the inspiration for Rope, but Rope isn't really the Leopold and Loeb story. No. They're just the inspiration of the characters. I avoided it. I said, I don't want to watch anything that has anything to do with them. So for a while, Rope was a no-no in my house, but I've recently rediscovered it and enjoyed it and wrote about it in my book.
Yeah.
Something I found interesting with this, Tony, you and I, when we did Streetcar Named Desire, we got into discussion how some movies you can tell it was adapted from a play, and some movies you can't. Streetcar was, because most of it was a couple of sets, you could tell it was adapted. In this movie, I felt like I was watching a play that had been
filmed. Well, that was
plain and simple.
That's what Hitchcock wanted to do. His daughter said that he had a goal of, he wanted to film a play. And when he finally split from Selznick in the late 40s, incredibly frustrated, and created his own company, he said that's the first thing he wanted to do. He wanted to film a play. And that's really what he did. I mean, there's no ways around it. I mean, this really is in real time, as you said, Stephen. All the tricks, we see them now. I just wonder if 1948 audiences would have been so aware of them, of the cuts, right. And how he tried to seamlessly film them in. But I think Jimmy Stewart said the only thing that got rehearsal in this movie was the damn scenery, because the scenery was all on wheels. And he had to pull walls out and move doorways to kind of give this effect of a seamless flow of action. And when you look at it that way, it is pretty amazing that he was able to pull that off so effectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And the actors probably rehearsed it like they were doing a play, because they were doing, they had to do, they weren't doing short little takes. It was 10 minutes. Of knowing all that dialogue, all of their movements, dodging cameras, dodging scenery. And there's all these fascinating things that Hitchcock did, like focusing on just a piece of furniture while you're hearing people talk and not seeing them. And when that happens, there's this gigantic backdrop in the windows in their beautiful apartment, and there's maybe one that's daytime, one that's dusk, and one that's nighttime, and they have to somehow get out the old one and get on the new
It's
one
amazing.
while the camera isn't facing it, and just get it there. It's really, really remarkable. And he didn't have to do it that way. I mean, he could have filmed it like a regular movie, even though it was sort of stagey and in one room. I wonder what made him think to do that, but it certainly adds to the suspense because you feel like you're there.
Yeah.
You feel like you're in that room with these two very strange guys.
I agree with you. I think it worked 100%.
Yeah.
Critics at that time, and even Hitchcock himself, disagrees with us.
Yeah.
They thought it was a failure. Even Robert Redford, or not Robert, he wishes he was Robert Redford. Even Roger Ebert said he agrees with Hitchcock that it was an experiment fail. I disagree 100%. I think it worked really well.
Well, here's what's interesting to me is he's taking on this huge technical challenge of trying to create this film that looks like it's one shot, and he's doing it in Technicolor.
Yeah.
This was not only his first Technicolor film. I don't know why you would do this for your challenge. You're taking a pretty big challenge as it is, but you're going to do it in Technicolor. And at this time, Technicolor cameras were like the size of a refrigerator.
Right.
I mean, they were huge. So not only are you having to move sets and move doorways and get actors out of the way and go over cables and go under, you're moving to these things which are the size of refrigerators. So I think the actors are almost superfluous in this movie because the most interesting things are the technical things that he achieves.
And that's actually what critics felt. They felt it distracted. I didn't feel that.
Yeah, I don't think it distracted from it, but I would say that, I don't think necessarily the actors, quote, best takes were used.
Yeah.
It was just as long as everything went smooth, that's what we're printing. So, if you did, as long as you hit your mark, it was going to be, it was going to be usable. I think when we look at it today, we just see a good, solid film, and we're not really aware of not as aware of the gimmick as they were back then. And I agree with you, Brad. I think that it's not that it wasn't successful. It worked. I mean, it's not like it was a disaster, but I think probably what the critics were honing in on was why do it all like that? Because you're right.
Mm-hmm.
You have these refrigerator sized cameras, you have moving furniture, and quite an interesting story.
Not only all these obstacles, but hello, it's about homosexuals.
Absolutely.
I mean, okay, let's throw that in the mix as well. Not only are you doing these technically astounding feats, the two main characters are gay. Now
oh, come on. It was very subtle. You could hardly tell.
Please. And that's
how would anybody know?
They couldn't even say homosexual. Arthur Lawrence said they said it. They said it's a movie about it. The two characters are it, not homosexual. And they're gay. It's crazy.
But you have to hand it to them because, we hear all of this about the Hayes office and what you could say. It is so clear that they're a couple in this movie. It is not hidden at all.
They have one bedroom.
Yeah.
There's one bedroom.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
It's hysterical.
Well, actually, I caught two things when I just recently watched it. They go out of their way for the character of Brandon, when he's talking to the leading lady, to sort of mention that he and that leading lady had once had a past romance.
Right, I saw that.
And then they do talk about the bedroom, but then a character gets a phone call and the maid says, take it in the first bedroom.
Oh.
Which to me is like, it's like, okay, there's the one thing that they had to put in, but that could mean there was a guest room.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
But they act like a couple. They talk about, Brandon at one point says, well, Philip is going to stay at my mom's house for a while. Like, your roommate wouldn't be staying at your mom's house. It was crazy. I mean, and when you think that if the production code or the Hayes office really was stringent, they could have made them brothers, I guess. They could have.
I don't know brothers.
If they
I don't know brothers who look at each other that way. I don't know brothers who take off the other one's clothing that way.
Right. But
except for the Menendez brothers.
That's well, oh my God. Oh, don't get me started. But that's what they could have done, something like that. But they really let almost everything fly. I mean, he takes off his gloves for the other guy, and that champagne cork popping moment, and and all of that, and they're treated like a couple by everyone,
everybody.
and it's treated like
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
It's actually very progressive.
Totally
for the time.
non-judgmental.
It's totally non-judgmental. It's really fascinating. I don't know how anyone. It's interesting to think of how audiences back then took it. Did they just think, well, these are two roommates, two best friends? Or did everyone realize it? Because now you just can't watch it without knowing.
Yeah, I think it was a mixture of both. I think the smart people got it, and I think the people who were oblivious, and they just thought they were very good friends because they were also, in addition to being homosexuals, they were also murderers.
Right.
Because we either had to be murdered or we had to be murderers in order to get past the production code in 1948.
Exactly.
And actually, I wondered why they couldn't have gotten it through the production code because they were homosexuals, and in the end, they turned out to be psycho killers.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought maybe they could have got away with that.
That's the only reason. Tell us what it's about.
It's a 1948 psychological thriller, an excellent example of a cat and mouse film, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It's based on the 1929 play by Patrick Hamilton, and I was really surprised to see that was adapted by Hume Cronin, who I never knew was anything but an actor. I didn't know he did behind-the-scenes stuff. And the screenplay was by Arthur Lawrence. Starred John Dahl as Brandon Shaw, and his kind of sort of, yes, we know it's his gay lover, Farley Granger as Philip Morgan. Also had James Stewart as Rupert, their one-time professor. And I'm going to bring up, there's a great other cast, but I am going to bring up Dick Hogan, who played David Bentley. And the reason I'm bringing up Dick Hogan is his career he's had several dozen films. Some of them were very small parts. Some of them were starring roles. I think
Smaller than this one?
This was his final film, and he was at what, 30 seconds at most?
He plays a corpse. It reminded me of what Betty Davis.
We see him collapse as the second he dies.
It reminds me of what Betty Davis said about one of her very first movies, The Menace. She goes, "I play a corpse. I fall out of a closet." Now she got it wrong. That didn't happen, but it's just so funny. So his claim to this is he plays a corpse. There you go. It's not a difficult
his last film.
acting challenge.
Speaking of him playing that corpse, I've got to just to show how quaint this era was. Here is the feedback from critic May Tinney with the Chicago Tribune when this film came out. She said, "If Mr. Hitchcock's purpose in producing this macabre tale of murder was to shock and horrify, he has succeeded all too well. The opening scene is sickeningly graphic, establishing a feeling of revulsion which seldom left me during the entire film." My God, that is so tame by today's standard.
It's nothing. I mean, they have a rope around his neck and they're choking him, but it's not graphic. I don't call that graphic. Was that even graphic in 1948? Maybe.
According to her, it was. I don't know what she'd been watching.
Clearly,
I guess so.
Well, she hadn't been on Omaha Beach apparently, and she
hadn't watched Bride of Frankenstein. We talked about how horrific that was.
That's hysterical. It's so graphic. I also love the fact you call him Arthur Lawrence. He probably would have appreciated that, Brad. I always know him as Arthur Lawrence, but Barbara calls him Arthur Lawrence. But we can go with your pronunciation. I like it a lot better of Arthur Lawrence, who, yes.
It's spelled Lawrence to me.
He did write the screenplay. Yes, he did. And for people who don't know,
I almost said De Laurentiis.
Arthur Lawrence also wrote a little musical called West Side Story. He wrote a musical called Gypsy. And he wrote a film called The Way We Were. But we're not going to talk about The Way We Were right now. And Arthur Lawrence was...
Oh, God. Well, Tony, you'll go for hours.
And Arthur Lawrence was, in fact, a homosexual. If you want to use that word. He was gay, and he thinks that's probably one of the reasons why Hitchcock hired him, was because he was gay. And also, he had just worked on a film called The Snake Pit with Olivia de Havilland, which was getting some good buzz. So when Lawrence was basically cleaning up this play, what his task was to get it past the production code, and they did this quite a bit, was removing all of the "my dear boys," because this is a British play. Rope's End was a British play. He removed all the "my dear boys" and all the British language because in an American mouth, "my dear boys" sounds very gay. He took them all out, and then he left the production, and the producer came back in and put back in all the "my dear boys" into the script. So when it went to the PCA, Production Code Administration, they apparently, according to Arthur Lawrence, made big circles around the "my dear boys" and put "homosexual out, out, out." So what they did was, by having all those cuts, other things which are so much more obvious went right over the PCA's head. And
That's
they did this
right.
a lot. Hitchcock was very smart about this. They would throw in their, their MacGuffins, if you will, to get the attention of the production code administration. So the real stuff that could really show that these two guys were homosexuals went right over the production code's head, which I love about that. I love they did
It makes me wonder, what did Hume Cronin do? Because it says that he did the adaptation and then Arthur Lawrence wrote the screenplay. Uh, Hume Cronin was, as far as I know, straight as an arrow and married to Jessica Tandy. I did see, incidentally, off Broadway, a production of Rope,
Oh,
the full British version, and it starred Sam Trammell, who was later on True Blood, the series True Blood.
yeah.
He did a really good job, and it's very British. It's very, very British, and much more highbrow and much more intellectual. So I wonder if, for some reason, Hume Cronin sort of Americanized the story, and then Lawrence wrote the screenplay.
Well, Hitchcock liked to do this. Hume wrote the
Yeah.
treatment. Hume Cronin wrote the treatment, basically.
Uh-huh.
And then he brought on Arthur Lawrence to write the screenplay. And Hitchcock liked to do that. According to Hume Cronin, he would frequently have someone else write the adaptation and then bring in a screenwriter, because Arthur Lawrence was a playwright. So to write the and you can't forget the fact that he was also gay. So, and they knew that. I mean, it wasn't common knowledge, but people knew. They weren't stupid. And I think that's another reason, too, why he brought in Arthur Lawrence to do this.
I think what happened is they had their Paul Lynde, Rip Taylor, Charles Nelson Riley blinders on and purposely weren't seeing it.
Oh, yeah, I think so, too. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, it was just over their, it was over their heads. It went right. Some of these things went right over their heads. Also casting two gay actors to play the main roles. Now, originally, I don't know if you saw this, Hitchcock went to Montgomery Clift, as everybody did at this time, went to Montgomery Clift, and he was like, no, staying away from that one.
That was going to hit too close to home, yeah.
Yeah, and also went to Cary Grant, who also said, staying away from that one, Hitch. And that's why we got a very, very miscast, in my opinion, James Stewart as Rupert, and John Dahl and Farley Granger, who were both gay actors. Farley Granger was pretty out. Am I right about that, Stephen? I mean, he was like, look, I'm bisexual. So. I don't give a fuck what you think, which I love. James Dahl, I think, was probably a little more in the closet at this time. But James Dahl had made a very great success on The Corn is Green. And Farley Granger was basically just making his name in Hollywood when they were cast. So that was very brave of them to do this and play such two obvious, to us at least, homosexual characters.
Exactly. But the thing was, they had an out. They could say, nowhere does it say there's nothing romantic. Right. Nowhere does it say that they're a couple. It's just very obvious when you watch it, but they could say, no, they're just roommates. You crazy pervert. What are you looking? What are you saying?
It's a thriller. What's wrong with you? You're sick.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, it's, and it was known that it was inspired by Leopold and Loeb, and Leopold and Loeb, as we're going to talk about later, were in a relationship with each other. I mean, the details were quite different. But so when you put Leopold and Loeb in, and while it was scandalous, people knew that there was something going on between the two of them. So I think it was pretty well known. I wanted to tell you guys, not only did I get to meet Farley Granger, I also got to meet Jimmy Stewart, and forgot to tell you this, Tony, I met Arthur Lawrence.
Oh, yeah.
Or Lawrence, whatever you want to say. So
either way,
I got I had the rope, trifecta, so to speak. And I was able to speak very briefly with Farley Granger about Rope. He was doing a book signing, but at a very small venue where, it was very intimate. So there weren't a lot of people by design. And he talked about his career, and then everyone was able to have, a few moments with him. And I had just played basically the same role that he played in Rope. I played Nathan Leopold. He played a character based on him. And, and I told him that that's what I had recently done. And I wrote a whole play about the story. And he was quite old. And he said something like, that was a great role. And, he sort of gave me a smile. So that was very
Oh.
thrilling. James Stewart, we didn't talk about Rope because that was also at a book signing where he had written a book of poetry, and he shook my hand and said, "Hello, I'm Jimmy Stewart." And I said, "I know." And then, so we didn't get to talk about Rope. And then Arthur Lawrence, I went and saw him speak, and he did talk about Rope at that speech. And I introduced myself briefly at the end, and God, was he mean.
That's what,
He was like,
that's
"Hi."
unfortunately the standard line about Lawrence was that he was just not a nice
And I'm
person.
like, and I was probably 22 or 23. You're lucky that a young person cared about you then. But
Yeah.
but anyway, but a very talented man, though.
Tony, you and I get excited when we get messages and emails and texts from listeners that tell us how much they enjoy the show.
We do.
But I think we should push it a little bit and ask them to go a little bit further.
Ooh, a challenge.
If you enjoy this show, let others know. 5 stars are great, whatever you want to give, except 1 star. If you have 1 star, say, that show's not for me and move on.
Yeah, you don't give us 1 star. Just say, no, not for me. Just skip it. Or tell your friends. That's the best way too, right? Tell your friends, hey, I have this great fun podcast with these 2 kooky guys who talk about movies and TV. We run the gamut. We have everything.
Yeah, we're all over the place.
We're all over the place is a better way to put it.
But in a good way. So do it right now before you forget. I think it's a good time, Stephen, for us to delve into the backstory, and then we can talk about how the movie changed. I do want to say one thing, because, Tony, you said that Jimmy Stewart was poorly cast, and I used to agree with you, because I know I believe in the play I've heard that Farley Grange's character, it was alluded to that he had an affair with Jimmy Stewart's character.
John Dahl's character.
John Dahl. I'm sorry, you're correct. John Dahl's character.
Yeah, Brandon. Yeah.
I used to think so, but, I watched it, as far as being a kind of a weird philosopher kind of thing, I think he did a really good job. I think he had this superior, not in the same way that John Dahl did, but this kind of superiority to himself, the way he thought, the way he comes across with those little snippy lines, and maybe obviously he didn't write them, but I think he played them well.
I think he's terribly miscast. I think in the play it's more of an Oscar Wilde type character.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just keep thinking, wouldn't it have been great if we had James Mason playing this part?
Oh, that would have been
great
fabulous.
if we had Clifton Webb play this part, because that's really, well, maybe not Clifton Webb, he's a little too old, but that's really, so Jimmy Stewart trying to be like, really, girl? I'm sorry. He seems so uncomfortable to me. The only, when he does make some, he kind of comes back a little bit, saves face a little bit, is when he comes back and he's now the detective, because Jimmy Stewart could do that. He could be the detective.
Right.
But trying to be this flippant, kind of sarcastic, I'm not buying it.
He wasn't. I think James Mason would have been way better. I'm glad you brought that up. He just didn't do as bad as I had remembered.
The interesting thing is, I think Jimmy Stewart comes across at least authoritative, but what's really funny is there's the scene in the movie where he and Mrs. Atwater are talking about movies, and she mentions James Mason, Errol Flynn, Cary Grant. She's talking about all of Jimmy Stewart's contemporaries who might have been better in the movie, and it's kind of a very early example
than he was.
Yes, very early example of meta.
Yes, exactly. Well, I just want to say one more thing about Jimmy Stewart, and then we can move on. But in Jimmy Stewart's, to his credit, this was a very tricky time in his career. He had just come back from the war. He was a war hero. We know that. He had made It's a Wonderful Life, and it didn't do well. We all look at it now as this epic film. We know that, but it did not do well initially. So Jimmy Stewart was in a very precarious place in his career. He had not yet become the 50s Jimmy Stewart we know from Vertigo and from Rear Window. So he was trying to regain his footing. So I got to give him a little credit for being brave enough to take this on, even though I think he's terribly miscast.
And actually, I have a question on that, because I know movies that Jimmy has been in, but I'm not really familiar how his career progressed. Given that this was his first movie after the war that actually, didn't even do great.
It wasn't his first. It wasn't his first movie. It was one of the first.
No, given that he was in so many Hitchcock films, did Hitchcock help make his career?
Oh, don't you? Yeah, he definitely gave Jimmy the second run of his career with Rear Window and Vertigo, and he gave him a new persona, basically, as as he also added to Cary Grant's persona. But at this point, Jimmy Stewart was still just trying to find his footing because he was no longer, he wasn't young Mr. Smith Goes to Washington anymore, but he wasn't quite yet at that point in his middle life where he could play the parts like he played in Rear Window and Vertigo. So this was a very precarious time for him. So I do give him credit for doing that.
It's interesting the way you mentioned how he's miscast. That might have been how they got away with the rest of it.
Oh, yeah, I think
By
so.
having Jimmy Stewart not coming across gay, not seeming like he would have had a little thing with the Brandon character.
Very smart.
It sort of deflected it. Whereas if they had
Yes.
gone with someone like James Mason, it just might have been way too much. Maybe they knew what they were doing.
Too much.
Well,
Well, that's what we said about when Brad and I talked about Breakfast at Tiffany's. We're like, how do you basically film a story about a hooker? Well, you get Audrey Hepburn to play the hooker,
right.
And then suddenly it's all kind of made pretty and it's all kind of diffused. Yes, absolutely.
Well, it's especially, I don't know how much people knew about Jimmy's personal life back then, but knowing what a staunch conservative he is, that to watch that film, that's what made me really feel like he was out of place.
Yeah. Well, Arthur Lawrence said he had no sex. He said he wasn't straight. He wasn't gay. There's no sex with Jimmy Stewart. He's Jimmy Stewart. So, but that's
that works for me.
Arthur Lawrence. So Brad, now we've been talking for a half an hour about this film. What the hell is it about?
I don't know.
It's about an hour and 20 minutes.
That's what it is. Yeah, it is about an hour and 20 minutes.
What this film is we have John Dahl and Farley Granger as two buddies, a little more than buddies, who Farley Granger is kind of the very dominant of the two, the very stronger character.
I'm sorry, John Dahl is.
Did I say Farley Granger?
Yeah.
I really like Farley Granger.
Well, join the club.
John Dahl did nothing for me, so I think that's probably why I keep going to Farley. John Dahl's character is the leader in all this. He's the one that's a lot more twisted, whereas Farley's more the manipulative character. And John Dahl he's been listening to Jimmy Stewart's character Rupert. I couldn't remember his name. Yeah. Rupert was their philosophy teacher, and he had done a lot of talk about, as philosophers do, about murder is okay as long as you have a superior intellect, and I wish I could remember the Irish author that wrote about eating children. It wasn't to be taken literally.
Well, it was a lot of Nietzsche and Master Race.
Yeah,
that's
right.
what he's kind of putting across.
Totally Nietzsche.
There. Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, John Dahl's character, he kind of took it a little too seriously. And he was very turned on by the idea of, let's take someone of less intellect that we are superior to and kill them and see what it's like. And they deserve it anyway. And it's not that anybody's going to care. So he and Farley, at the very beginning of this movie, opens up with Dick Hogan as David Kentley. I shouldn't even say Dick Hogan, it was so fast. David being, you are seeing the noose around his neck. You hear his last gasp and he falls. That's how the movie begins. And the rest, they put him into a chest, and the rest of the movie takes place with them. Well, John Dahl wanting to really manipulate and see what he can get away with. He's a very sick, twisted man.
Well, they're throwing a party with the murder victim's family there. David's father, who's played by Cedric Harwick, his aunt.
He even goes so far as to give the father books and ties it up with the rope that he killed the man's son with. I mean, he is so sick. I feel like almost he was too evil. I would have liked him to be a little more vulnerable. But that's the whole thing. It's really them having this dinner party around this dead body in a crate, and him getting his thrills, getting away with as much as he possibly can, knowing what he knows and them not knowing what they know.
Yeah.
And
Jimmy
Stewart's character, Rupert, catching on, like, I think there's something more here going on.
Yeah, he eventually figures it out.
It's a cat mouse film.
So it is. So at the end, of course, they get caught by Jimmy Stewart, and that's how it ends. They go to prison. But what's interesting to me about this, about Rope, and why I've always been fascinated by Rope, is the tie-in with Leopold and Loeb. And I think, for people who don't know who Leopold and Loeb were, we have an expert with us today.
That's right.
I think it's even before your time, Tony.
It is even before my time, just barely. Bitch. But you think John Dahl's bitchy. You better watch it, buddy. But I think that Stephen, if you, I mean, you are the expert on this because you wrote a fabulous play about Leopold and Loeb. Tell us a little bit about how Leopold and Loeb all factor into this and what the whole, just the whole idea behind it.
Sure.
If you would,
Well,
please.
as as you described the plot of Rope, Brad, it's basically the story of a dinner party with a dead body in a crate with a buffet dinner being served on top of it. And 80 minutes after the murder, they're caught. And that is not at all what Leopold and Loeb did, not even close. But Leopold and Loeb were two young guys. They were geniuses. They lived in Chicago, and this all took place in 1924 when they were about 19 years old. But they were such geniuses that they had graduated high school when they were about 15, 16, and were already in college and were getting ready to go to law school. And the summer before law school, when they were each living individually in their own parents' home in Chicago, they hatched this plan, again, based on their love of Nietzsche's theory of the Superman and that they were superior. They hatched this plan to commit a murder just for the thrill, for no reason, not for a robbery, not for revenge, not for anything other than because they believed they were superior, which is what they talk about in Rope a lot, and that they could get away with it. And they would commit the perfect crime and then go off and become lawyers and all of that. Meanwhile, the two of them were in a sexual relationship with each other. They didn't live together in a swanky penthouse like they do in Rope, because they live with their parents. But they were definitely in a relationship, right? And and Leopold really wanted to have a lot of sex with Loeb, and Loeb was more interested in having crimes that Leopold would help him with. And so they created this sort of contract between them. You do this for me and I'll do that for you. It was like a quid pro quo type of a thing. So they decide that they're going to kill Loeb wants to kill his younger brother. And then they decide, that might not be a good idea. That might sort of hit it a little too close to home. Maybe we could come up with someone else.
That's a little too far.
Yeah. Well, it was just like the logistics, So then they decide they'll kill just a random kid, a younger kid. And they get it. They sort of know some of the neighborhood kids. And the night that they're planning to do the murder, one of their murder weapons was indeed a piece of rope plus a chisel and acid. So they choked him and chiseled him and poured acid on him to try to disguise him or make it so he wouldn't be recognized. Yeah, it was very much more gruesome than in Rope. And if that critic lady thought that Rope was bad, she should have read about the real one. So they're trying to find whatever kid they think they're going to find, and they can't find him, but they come across this young boy who was about 14 named Bobby Franks. To make a long story short, lure him into their car, kill him, bury him by shoving him up like a culvert pipe, which is like a water pipe in like a park near a creek, sort of, and think that they have done the perfect crime, and they're happy and they're going to go on about their lives and go to law school and do whatever. And they're caught almost immediately because Nathan Leopold has accidentally dropped his brand new reading glasses, like right at the foot of the body, and they don't notice it. And because these guys were rich and of good families, wouldn't you know it, Nathan Leopold had the latest, fanciest glasses that had these brand new hinges on them. And only 3 people in Chicago had them.
That narrows it down.
One was an old lady who, went and got them when the police came a-knocking. One was a man who had them on. And the third was Nathan Leopold.
Fashion will kill the gay man. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is.
Exactly, right? So, cut to, they confess because, they had them dead to rights. And they are represented by the great Clarence Darrow, who, was famous for the Scopes Monkey trial, creationism.
Right. Inherit the Wind, basically,
versus,
is based on,
whatever.
Yeah.
Exactly, Inherit the Wind. And he came out of retirement to represent them, but they pled guilty because, there was no choice. So their trial was just, will they get the death penalty or will they get life in prison? And Darrow made this very long argument in court. It went on for, legends say, hours, and he won. And by winning, that meant they got life in prison and not the death penalty. So it was considered a win. Loeb, a few years later, was murdered in the prison shower after making a pass at another inmate. He was
Yeah.
shivved. And Leopold was eventually paroled after many years and many tries. I think it was the fifth time he was finally paroled, and lived a quiet life until his death in the 1970s. And so that's the Leopold and Loeb story. And I'm sure that all of your wonderful podcast listeners have realized that that's not
No.
rope at all.
It's pretty close, though. I'm surprised that
but
the basis of the story is the whole Nietzsche thing.
Nietzsche and two guys that kill someone for no reason. Other than that,
Yeah.
the plot and what happened isn't the same. And I have spent the last 20 years of my life, when Thrill Me, my musical about Leopold and Loeb, which certainly has dramatic license, is not a point-by-point exact replica of exactly what happened, because that would be very boring. That's what documentaries are for. I have had to endure people saying things like, "Thrill Me, the Leopold and Loeb story. Oh my God, I love rope, so I can't wait to see this."
I'm sorry.
You're gonna be so disappointed because it's not like that at all. Or the opposite. Well, Stephen, I'd like to see your play, but I don't like the movie Rope. And I feel like, yeah, okay, but so you might like this because it's really nothing like it. And when I wrote my book, Thrillmaker, which was published to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the crime and the 30th anniversary of me starting to write Thrill Me, and it's called Thrill Me because they were known as the Thrill Killers. And then the book about it is called Thrill Maker because I guess I'm the guy who made the Thrill Me. Yeah. So I was the Thrill Maker.
I love the title.
So, I thank you. I talk about in the book that, I've spent many years of my life saying Rope is not the Leopold and Loeb story. It's inspired by the people, but it's not.
So
the
here's
story.
Here's a podcast that invites you to come on and talk about Rope.
Exactly, which is perfect because now I can say, see how different it is. And
yes,
it's not that I don't like Rope. I think it's a wonderful movie based on a wonderful play, and it is undoubtedly inspired by Leopold and Loeb, but it's not the Leopold and Loeb story per se. But it's it definitely draws inspiration from them. But if you like Rope, I think you'll also love Thrill Me. And if you love Thrill Me, you've got to see Rope. But just don't think you're going to be seeing a musical version of the same thing or a film like
So I'm curious, I hate to ask this question because I know it's a difficult question for writers to know where their inspiration came from. But what was it about this story that you think just drew you to it that you had to write a musical about it?
Well, way back when I first started.
The story of Leopold and Loeb, not Rope.
Yes. Well, right. Because I have not written a musical version of Rope. Let's get that clear. It was around 1994. I had an idea. I had two separate ideas. One was that I wanted to write a 2-character musical about an intense relationship between two people. What that would be or who that would be, I didn't know. And I wanted to write a true crime musical. What true crime that would be, I didn't know.
I thought you were going to say you wanted to write a true love story.
Yeah. Look what I ended up doing. So I had those two ideas, and one day I was in a bookstore and I came across this big book of famous American criminals. So I would thumb through it, and there was Bonnie and Clyde, Al Capone, Billy the Kid, Lizzie Borden, and I came to a chapter on Leopold and Loeb, and it was the two of them together. And I had heard of them, but I didn't really know much about them. And I read this, 5-page outline of their story, which I pretty much just told you when I told you what happened. And I knew right then and there that could be my 2-character musical and my true crime musical combined. And I went home from the bookstore that day in 1994, and my life has never been the same because Leopold and Loeb and Thrill Me are part of my life literally every single day. For example, today I'm recording this podcast with you guys.
That's amazing.
Tomorrow I've got a contract to negotiate with my agent for a production, somewhere. And, I make my living off of pretty much the royalties from Thrill Me. And I'm always answering questions or doing interviews or engaging with fans or social media. So it really changed my life. And had I known that it would be such a big hit, I probably wouldn't have, it probably wouldn't have been, because I imagined it as this grungy little show that would play in a theater down in the East Village of Manhattan, midnights with no scenery and a lot of smoke and red lights, and it would run for a few weeks and then I would move on to my next thing. I thought it would be a stepping stone. And it took a long time before anyone ever produced it. It sat in a drawer for about 7 years, despite all of my hard work. But once it was produced, it became a big hit all around the world, more so in Europe and Asia, mostly. Like you could go see it tonight in South Korea. You could go see it tonight in Mexico City.
I was wondering what I was going to do in South Korea tonight. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for letting me. That's good.
I was just thinking how much I'd love it, but I think South Korea's off the list for me today.
Well, here's what's fascinating is that we're about Thrill Me and about Leopold and Loeb and Rope. Clearly, we are fascinated, and the Menendez brothers. Clearly, we are fascinated by these characters who are on some kind of a spectrum,
Right?
who create, this murder, Leopold and Loeb, and translated into Rope and translated into Thrill Me, have fascinated us, just as they fascinated you. They live through time. There's something about these people doing these incredibly, I don't want to say, well, they were heinous. Leopold were heinous, and these guys killed their friend David. So these heinous things that fascinate us, so much so that we're talking about this movie from 1948 today. Your play has been running for 30 years, for God's sake, somewhere. So what do you think it is about these characters, whether it be Leopold and Loeb, whether it be Brandon and Philip, that fascinate people so much that there's films made inspired by these people and by their acts?
Because they had everything. They were, as our Brandon and Philip depicted in Rope, and the real Leopold Loeb, they were rich, they were educated, they wanted for nothing.
Yeah.
They had good families, they had each other. I mean, they had a partner that ended up being a partner in crime, but a partner, and they threw it all away. Leopold and Loeb could have each been their own Clarence Darrow. And who knows what they could have accomplished with their lives, but they threw it all away just for kicks, for the thrill, for the fun, because, they read about it in Nietzsche, where they heard about it from their philosophy professor, as in Rope. And it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling. And I think that's what draws people to the story. And, and it's also, it makes for a really good thriller. And one thing that I've always liked about it, I was asked a lot early on, how do you feel as a gay author, composer, writer, vilifying these two gay characters or writing about gay murderers? And I just feel like I feel great, because it's like they're just like everybody else.
Yeah.
They are just like everybody else.
It's true.
There are plenty of murders. It would be wrong to not do it, because don't want to touch that, or I don't want them to look bad. No, let's see it. It's a very human story. They might as well be a man and a woman. They could be brothers, like we were talking about earlier. It has nothing to do with the fact that they were gay or were in a relationship with each other. It has to do with the story. And I think it's got everything in it. It's got sex, it's got love, it's got murder, it's got
illicit sex,
lawyers, it's got everything.
It's got a crazy aunt.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating that people know it so well today, as you said, because if you ask people about a murder at the turn of the last century, because these guys weren't serial killers, I think there's two murders that would come to mind. The Lindbergh baby, obviously because of Lindbergh.
Yeah.
And then two guys that just killed one kid. Well, I mean, I shouldn't just say one kid, but, it's not like murder wasn't going on back then.
Right.
But two guys that just randomly killed a kid, and we still know them today. And it's because of that story, that very unique story.
Well, it's also because of the fact that they did it as an intellectual exercise.
It makes it more terrifying.
It makes it more terrifying, and it's what gives it an added allure, as with Rope. These are two men who are doing this for the thrill. It's a thrill kill. It's not passion. It's not self-defense. It's an intellectual exercise, and that's so cold. It's the ultimate crime done from this very, very cold place, which, fascinates people with normal guides of morality. They're like, how could you possibly do this? But It's done every day. And because they happen to be gay, it also gives it that little edge of illicit activity, I think, which is also very tantalizing about this. So.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for explaining that.
Steve, you brought up something that made me think of this film that drove me crazy, because you talked about them leaving the glasses behind at the real crime scene. Being a crime writer, it was driving me crazy, because I'm always thinking about the perfect murder, so don't piss me off. So being a crime writer, I'm always thinking about the perfect murder. And the whole time I'm watching this movie, I'm like, you're being so stupid. You're being so stupid. And of course, part of John Dahl's character was he wanted to be at the edge there. But still, I was like, and to hear they did something so stupid as to leave their glasses behind, I'm like, how in the world could you be so dumb? So
that's so common, though.
I guess I'll cut the film.
Yeah. And then they just crash.
When you get guys like that, they're so cocky.
Well, yeah, I think in the movie, in the Rope movie, the Brandon character, he thinks that by, sort of hiding everything in plain sight, that is how they're going to get away with it. So there's some rope here. So there's a giant, crate that just happens to have a body in it. So what? Just act like everything's perfectly fine.
And that's part of his thrill.
Yeah.
Exactly. The idea that they serve dinner on top of the dead body is just
on his grave, as Jimmy Stewart says, on his grave. They served a meal on his grave, and it's true. It's so true. And part of the thrill too is the fact that there's also this sexual this overtone, this undertone when they're substituting murder for sex. When they talk about the murder as if it was sex. John Dahl's character says he didn't feel anything until his body went limp, and I knew it was over, and then I felt tremendously exhilarated. I mean, it's fascinating to me that they were getting away with this in 1948, and the PCA had no clue.
I made that joke at the beginning, but I kept waiting for John Dahl's. For Brandon to say, excuse me, I've got to go change my pants. I mean, he was like,
oh my.
He had such sexual tension as he talked about it.
Not long after they put the body into the container, whatever it was, the chest, John Dahl's character, Brandon, lights a cigarette and takes a long puff off of it.
Yep.
I mean, come on. It's amazing to me that they got away with it. It's amazing to me. And I think that's one of the reasons why this movie, I have problems with this movie, but they're all very much, I'm not crazy about the fact that he did it in this style. I'm like, the story to me is much more interesting than these tricks that Hitchcock did.
Right.
But, for that reason, I would love to see it filmed just as a regular movie, just to see how effective it would be. But the fact that they got away with this stuff in 1948, I love it. I think it's fantastic that they did that.
I'll tell you what was really quaint to me, and listener, we keep talking about high anxiety, and I promise you, Tony and I talked about it again today. We are going to eventually get to high anxiety.
Yes.
High anxiety is a Mel Brooks' spoof on the Hitchcock films. And one thing he really plays on is Hitchcock's film techniques, which were amazing at that time period. We take them all for granted for now. The whole fading, the scene setup, I think of the best example I can think of is Birdcage, because one thing that really amazes people is you have that helicopter scene at the beginning of Birdcage flying in across the ocean, and it goes into the club, and it goes right up to the stage. And everybody's like, how did they do that in one take? But if you really watch, you can see there's a very quick, when the helicopter gets close to the club, two people walk by each other, and it's a very quick, where they clearly did the film cut. And it's so fast, people are fascinated because they don't realize that just happened. Knowing those film techniques today, you watch Hitchcock and it's almost so obvious, because why would you zoom on somebody's suit for, it seemed like 30 seconds. Obviously, it was only a few seconds. You zoom on somebody's suit for a little while and then a piece of furniture. And it really jumps out at us today. But back then, that was
no, they probably didn't notice it. Did you know about the trailer that they filmed for this, Stephen? Have you seen that, or have you heard about that trailer for this?
I have not heard about the story that you must be thinking of. So no.
Brad, do you know about this? So there was a trailer. Hitchcock shot a trailer that features David. That features the character of David, and it's basically a moment before, if you will. It is with David and with Janet, his intended, meeting in the park, in Central Park, just before he goes to meet Brandon and Philip, and he proposes to her. And so it's with the actors. It's with Dick Hogan and Joan Chandler, who played Janet. And she's saying, "I'll think about it. We'll talk about it after the party." He says. So he walks away, and Jimmy Stewart's voice comes in a voiceover and says, that's the last time she saw him alive. And I was like, that is a very cool trailer.
That is so Hitchcock.
I had no idea. How did I miss that?
Yeah, it's a really... So it's the...
I'll have to look for that.
It's the only screen time that Dick Hogan... the only lines that Dick Hogan got as David. So David did have a little bit of life. But I think that's fascinating that Hitchcock...
Wow.
So, yes. So anything else we want to say about Rope, about Thrill Me, about our fabulous guest, Stephen Dolginoff here, joining us to talk about his work and also about Rope, Brad?
I will say I'm excited to hear that you're in talks with your agent about doing a new production of it, because I would love to see this.
Yes, yes. Well, like I said, fly to South Korea tonight, and you can
go to South Korea and do it.
Keep me posted.
Thank you guys so much for having me. And
thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Yes, and I really appreciate it.
How can people get your book, listen to the CD? I'm assuming it's all on Amazon.
You can get anything on Amazon. That's the easiest way. The book Thrill Maker, the story of my musical Thrill Me, is on Amazon. The script of Thrill Me is published. You can get that on Amazon too, as well as the cast album with me singing the song.
I love that.
The songs as Nathan Leopold. I think you mentioned early on, I had to, and in an emergency, I had to take over the role of Nathan Leopold off Broadway. And like I told you, it was more like Peggy Sawyer in 42nd Street
yes.
than Eve Harrington in All About Eve. So maybe if you guys ever do All About Eve, I'll come and tell you the story of how I ended up starring as Nathan Leopold, because that's quite a story. But it's in the book.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you starred as Eve as well.
And
well, I wish.
Tell the people your website too, Stephen, so they can go to your website.
StephenDolginoff.com or thrillmaker.com. And that's StephenDolginoff.com or thrillmaker.com, just like it sounds.
And we will have a link in the show notes for people to check that out. So
thank you so much.
And I know over 90% of you listen to us on your phone, so it's right there on your phone.
So I've so enjoyed this so much, Stephen. Thank you so much. Brad, it's been so much fun that I really don't want to, I know I have to say it, but I really don't want to. So let's not say goodbye. Let's just say au revoir.
No, let's say goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
That's all, folks.